Project Lawful aka Planecrash by Arwain aka Eliezer Yudkowsky and Lintamande. The Woman of Irori, Episode 180.
Golarion.
You don't become a wizard if you have trouble falling asleep. It's a very fundamental constraint. Sometimes you'll be in a besieged fortress in the far north, where the sun lingers for months in the sky, and the air will never quiet with the screams of the dying and the roars of explosions. And you can sleep and regain your spells and continue being useful. Or you cannot, and the second category doesn't live long. Carissa does not remember ever having had trouble falling asleep at the World Wound, but she's having trouble now. It was a productive day. She reviewed all of the ongoing projects, made some predictions, congratulated the people who had the best ones, reviewed the security reports on all the new people until she could at least recognize their faces. Went to Asmodea's room, even though she's not a crime scene investigator and wasn't going to find anything, and to the acid vats, even though she's not a crime scene investigator and wasn't going to find anything. Learned that her new minion had been cleared by security as loyal and not enough of an idiot to be actively contemplating fucking up his second chance. Made a bit of spell silver for old time's sake. She didn't sleep last night. She stayed up all night finishing Pilar's headband. That should make it easier to sleep tonight, she's pretty sure. That's how sleep works. She has not sat down and thought hard about what Caden Kylian wants, or about the work she's taking over from Asmodea. The work of explaining what it is to obey Asmodeus so that Aspexia can teach her successor who will almost definitely not be Subarax. She's too tired, too unsettled, too uneasy. She should drink some tea tomorrow morning and then work on it with a fresh mind, thinking about it because she desperately wants to know instead of because she's trying not to let her brain go somewhere else. Is that what she's doing? She's been lying here with her eyes closed for nearly 2 hours, telling herself she'll solve those problems tomorrow. It's not really working. Not that she's successfully thinking, she's just unsuccessfully not thinking, lying here short-circuiting all her thoughts one by one, but not getting any closer to sleep. She's obviously not going to make further progress on figuring out anything important without some kind of reset, and yet she can't pry her thoughts off for long enough to even slightly rest. She does have an owl's wisdom hung and not yet cast. Eventually, in exasperation and vague awareness that the effect of this is almost definitely not going to be a cure for her insomnia, she traces her fingers near imperceptibly against her thigh and casts it. Still without opening her eyes, Carissa Sevar takes a deep breath and thinks. She's sad that Asmodea's gone. It was avoidable. She's sad that Mayal disappointed her. It might have been avoidable. She's sad that she had to get pulled away before she hit 5th circle, or for that matter, 6th circle. Subirax thought it'd be good for her, to come back to a disaster, to have to correct it with fire and lash. Subirax was correct about that. It was good for her. She feels like she's grown more in the last day than in, most individual days of the last 4 months, though it's had some really exceptional days. She should try to make progress on Aspexia's problem of obedience to gods. It seems a good thing to set the new Ilani on. If she has progress, she can evaluate theirs against, and not if she doesn't. She looks for the next thought, and her mind comes up empty. That's all there was. Nothing else to think about. No heresies. No secret realizations lurking. No courageous defiance, not even a properly thorough failure analysis. She's made so much progress. On not being a muddle, on not being made almost entirely of pieces that she shoved under her surface. She's an Asmodean and she's respected and she's feared, and there's nothing at all clawing its way towards the surface of her mind, tightly squirreled away from her self-awareness. There's nothing inside her that she's hiding from. No, that can't be right. That's not how people work. She can't have succeeded at becoming someone who has nothing dangerous to her Asmodeanism hidden inside her. It just has to be hidden deeper. But trying to reach deeper turns up the same thing. She's not Carissa Sevar of 4 months ago, not a muddle full of desires and ambitions, who would at least, right now, be writhing with guilt over hurting people, fretting about whether that security was somehow neutral evil, actually, grieving over Keltham. She wasn't sure if all the work she was doing really did anything, and now here's an answer. It did. She's a much, much better Asmodean. There is less of her waiting to burst out from behind her walls than she imagined. And where that should have been satisfying, it's actually not. Maybe that's the only real heresy left hidden inside her, that it feels terrible and wrong to realize how far she has come. She has 8 minutes of Owl's wisdom, less now, and that's not what she was hoping to find when she used them. But she can feel that the mental motion she's doing, keep looking, isn't getting anywhere. So if she needs another angle, an angle she perhaps ill-advisedly pressed out of herself, she can't just try to look harder for heresies inside herself. Where do you keep important things if you don't bury them? All right. Carissa Savar of 4 months ago. Carissa Savar who was less Ilani, more muddled. Carissa Savar who'd gone less far down the road, commanded. What is your assessment here? What do you think? The first immediately obvious thought is that she hasn't been doing that. Thinking, that is. She's been managing the project, punishing the traitors, hurting people until they respect her, flirting with Abigail, thinking down all the paths that look likely to immediately bring the project down in flames again, revisiting Hell's orders and checking whether she seems to be making progress on them, entertaining and rejecting new bits of Asmodean theology, keeping track of all the pieces she knows of on the board and the possibility of pieces she doesn't. This feels different from that, and not because she's wiser. This is a motion she could have taken at any time in the last 4 months while not actively being punished, and didn't, because why? Does she on some level think that Ione is right? That the truth is something she cannot bear up under? That she'll shatter like Piranza and throw everything away at once for nothing at all? That would be a reason not to think, if she believed that. It'd be a reason not to think now either, since that's still a risk. More of a risk, even. They can, in fact, still trap her in a box and leave her making headbands. She wouldn't even have to be much less valuable than she is now for that to be the thing to do with her. Pilar is right. Mostly, you can't enslave people and get them to make you magic items. It's not the kind of work you can usefully get out of people with pain, but you can get it out of Carissa with pain. Abigail knows that. Abigail wouldn't do that to her. She knows she's an idiot about Abigail, and on principle, she should assume that this is a deliberate thing Abigail did on purpose. Anyway, that would explain the not thinking. If she's worried she'll break and be useless, she's not sure that's why. She kind of suspects that it's, instead, because when she looked at herself, she wouldn't like what she saw. An obvious part, a necessary part, of becoming a slave of Asmodeus instead of a person. People don't tend to want to be slaves of Asmodeus. You have to hit them from exactly the right angle. Why dwell on it? And then there's the fact that Abigail will read it. And, maybe that's doing something strange to her thoughts. Possibly. In hindsight, maybe, actually. The processes that do their work coming up with Carissa thoughts have been working diligently in the knowledge that Abigail reads her thought transcripts. Mostly this has served to her benefit. When she thinks something before Meilol and Subirax, she says it, to be corrected faster if it's wrong. And she has been warned against stuffing things into the back of your mind rather than letting them be refuted, so she dragged them all out, to be refuted until they stopped appearing at all. She is impudent before the queen, and she is tolerated because Abigail can see her own handiwork that taught Carissa to feel things and to offer them up where Abigail could enjoy them and, if necessary, punish them. That's not quite a right frame, actually, but there's something to it. Mark it as half wrong and keep following it. Carissa started drawing out her thoughts and speaking them aloud, and she became freer and more ambitious and more happy and more alive. And some of her thoughts went away, and her mind is silent when she looks for the things it is hiding. This, too, will be printed out for Abigail, and perhaps she'll see what to do about it, or perhaps she won't, but... and as soon as she thinks that she knows it is wrong. All of this she has thought very calmly, lying near asleep in her bed, her face slack and expressionless, the voice in her head calm and even-keeled. And then there's a lurch of reorientation, everything being upside down. Are they reading her mind right now? She's nearly fifth circle, wearing a +6 headband. Conventionally, she'd be expected to detect an attempted divination more often than not against most of security. They could have someone more powerful on it, of course, harder to detect, but Abigail and Aspexia are genuinely busy finishing the war in Nidal. If Cheliax wants to read her without her noticing, she's not a softer target than Keltham, and they had him mind-read only rarely, as a significant commitment of resources. Also, everyone on security is terrified of pissing her off. And it's the dead of night, and for the last several hours, she's been uninterestingly attempting to sleep. They're probably not actually reading her mind right now. Forget the probably, which is an insufficient determination for something that matters as much as this. It is in her actual, sober, careful assessment, as soon as she turns her mind on the question, very unlikely that she is being mind-read. She's worked so diligently on not having thoughts that wilt under observation, on openly and boldly thinking in the presence of the Queen, on not having any parts of her hiding in dark corners so that she needn't fear any part of her being exposed. And suddenly it feels sideways, backwards, like it wasn't the achievement she thought it was, like maybe actually everything that matters is in the weeds beneath the paving stones she laid down in her mind while she prettied it up for an audience. But it no longer feels like there's nothing there. It feels like it's behind a wall which she is terrified of scaling, because, of course, probably not isn't definitely not. And it's not exactly, like she has nothing to lose. Be a fucking Ilani for once. It's not the right tool for every situation, but it's the right tool for when it's very, very important to figure out what's happening around you when you don't have knockdown arguments, just uncertainties that add up either to less or more uncertainty than they began with. The 7th Circle wizard on staff is almost certainly there to mind-read her and make sure she isn't about to defect. A 7th Circle wizard can read her frequently, if it's their only job, maybe a quarter of the time. So she could go around with a presumption on 3-1 odds against being mind-read at any given moment. However, a 7th Circle wizard specialized in divinations should be able to mind-read her without her noticing only about 2/3 of the time. She felt it once, while she was interrogating Maylol. That breaks down into some chance that it was a lie, that he's 7th Circle, that the wizard is much more powerful than that, or that they're a 7th Circle wizard with an uncanny knack for subtle spells. Or that they weren't, in fact, following her around, mind-reading her all the time, and did it a few times at particularly key moments, probably 3 or 4 times, listened for half an hour on each occasion, and was satisfied. She can feel part of her flinching away from this calculation. What's up with that? Oh, it's that part of her feels that thinking is only allowed if she is absolutely sure she is not being mind-read, and that no numbers that come out of a process like this will be absolute surety, so they may as well stop now. Well, she can do the math and then decide not to scale the wall, but there's kind of a lot at stake, right? There's whatever Caden Kaleen is playing at, and whatever Keltham is playing at, and whatever Asmodia is playing at, and a very real possibility. She hasn't thought about numbers, that Cheliax is going to be annihilated, and if she won't risk anything to scale the wall, then she's risking missing whatever's on the other side. Things you don't think about can still destroy you, so she has to keep trying. Before the observation, with Keltham in her head saying that only keepers can say, before the observation, and mean it, how likely would she have considered it, that this wizard had some kind of secret technique for reading people without being noticed? Vanishingly unlikely, because if Cheliax had that capability, they would have used it on Keltham instead of dragging the Queen and the Most High here personally. How likely would she have considered it that the wizard had only mind-read her 3 or 4 times, for the 15 to 30 minutes a caster of their level can do? Reasonably probable, if they didn't have instructions to do nothing at all but mind-read her. 3 or 4 times a day is a lot of mind-reading, by the standard of any non-project lawful project she's ever heard of. And it must have crossed the wizard's mind that Carissa Sevar might get annoyed with them. And besides, she was doing so well. She was so Asmodean. There are definitely feelings on the other side of the wall about that. Call it 20.1 in favor of I can notice them the approximately predictable amount over they're stealthy and I can almost never notice them. Is the stealthy version of this wizard who has instructions to read her as much as possible mind-reading her now? Even that wizard can't actually get 24-hour coverage and might choose to sleep themselves and prepare spells while Carissa Sevar is in bed tossing and turning and being boring. In fact, she probably seriously inconvenienced that wizard, what with not sleeping last night. Maybe 2-1 against, for the worst-case scenario wizard. Nearly all the chance she's being mind-read comes from the worst-case scenario wizard. The wizard who mind-read her approximately 4 times yesterday is something like 21 not reading her having boring insomnia in the dead of night. No, actually, wait. Could they have started mind-reading her when they cast the owl's wisdom? Only if someone saw it, and she's unscryable by strategic necessity and alarmed her surroundings and is, 10-1 maybe, alone in the room. She can see invisible people, unless they went to some considerable lengths. Her alarm would ping unless they went to even more considerable ones, and she doesn't think any security other than the 7th circle assigned to Carissa Observation would have the nerve tonight to creep into Carissa Sevar's bedroom around her alarm. They probably would mind-read her, though, if they did notice that. She has a higher chance, more like 50%, of noticing them with Owl's wisdom up. So 2 possibilities point towards the most worlds where she's currently being mind-read. Wizard with special skill at being sneaky and reading her near continuously, which she pegged at a 40th of worlds, and normal wizard who just got alerted she cast Owl's wisdom, which is about a 20th of worlds. The math isn't the answer, Keltham says, but it focuses your attention. But her gut agrees with the math. It's unlikely. It is not vanishingly unlikely. Is that good enough? The owl's wisdom only lasts 8 minutes. She thinks fast, with the headband on, much faster than other people. She can read books faster, hang spells faster, follow lines of speculation through her head faster. But 8 minutes isn't very long, really, if you might possibly have a big problem on your hands. She's lost fully 1 of them already to not understanding herself, and then 1 of them to calculating whether she's being mind-read. 6 to go. There is no point in wasting some of them on agonizing over a decision. She may as well make it right this second. Say there are 20 Carissi sitting in 20 rooms. How should they choose so the most of them survive not just this decision, but the war that is about to come? She is, actually, with a vague, lurching sense this is risking more than she's ever risked, willing to condemn 1 Carissa so all the other ones can scale that wall. Carissa Sevar, abide the twin damnation, Lintamande. And as soon as she thinks that she's climbed it in her head and is looking out at, still an empty space, but one that she can feel her brain already starting to unspool into, she doesn't have time to revel in it. She needs to figure out what she's trying to accomplish, what she's chosen to accomplish, what is possible to accomplish from here so she can get it done. Is she chosen by Asmodeus? What actual probability would she place between being of Asmodeus's choosing and being someone else's, with Irori as the likeliest candidate? Tropes are real, Keltham thought. Tropes meant she was a secret cleric. Secret clerics aren't even a thing. But Asmodea was right that they kept not thinking about tropes because of not liking to think about tropes. She likes it when people call her chosen of Asmodeus. That's not evidence at all. The Irorite, Darina, felt like meeting something she'd never met before, like meeting Keltham, like meeting something that she'd been groping blindly for her whole life. It seems like she did not, in fact, possess the skills necessary to run the conspiracy, which is some argument against Asmodeus having chosen her, though not a very powerful one since he wasn't stipulated to have a stunningly clear understanding of human nature anyway. But surely Asmodeus's interventions cannot have been pointed at this. This is a failure, a catastrophic one. She isn't sure what her mistake is, willfully turns herself away from trying to find it now. There'll be time for that later. Does it serve someone else instead? Presumably, Asmodeus would not have, even for a high price, put the selection of another god in power over his project. Though he could have been too confused to have a guess about whether she'd do better or worse than anyone else. It could have been part of the tangled web of commitments that brought Keltham here and brought Caden Kaleen on board. She can sense already that she's turning her mind in the wrong direction. Thinking about questions Owl's wisdom will help her with only a little, not thinking about the ones right in front of her. Even knowing that, even making that explicit in front of her, it still takes additional effort to make herself drop the "what do the gods want" question. What's the thing she's looking away from? Like opening your eyes to stare directly at the sun. Asmodeus is not a god who gives you what you want as a reward for your service to him. Asmodeus is owed your service. You cannot become a power in hell through your exceptional and exemplary service to Asmodeus. You'll just be Asmodea, plaintively saying to everyone around that they should do what's in Cheliax's interests, while they laughed at her, while Mayal laughed at her, while Avaricia laughed at her, while they knew the rules she was born outside, didn't know, must have known. The strong win and the weak suffer. She could conquer all of Cheliax, and in hell she would be Asmodeus's most treasured possession. He told her that. She could build an army of devils, and it wouldn't make her a power in hell. She could understand everything perfectly, have all the answers, and that would make her a very clever slave. The way to fix hell isn't to purchase Asmodeus's gratitude. It's to fucking fight him and beat him and make him do what you say. If humanity could overthrow Asmodeus, they obviously should. She was using this fact about the world to make predictions already, on some level. Even though actually thinking it feels like falling off a cliff, she can never, ever climb back up. It is in the interests of Asmodeus to enslave humans. It is not in the interests of humans to be Asmodeus's slaves. It is worse for them than many of their other options. Of slave owners, even assuming the rest of the gods are precisely that. Asmodeus enjoys tyranny, enjoys cruelty, enjoys subservience. A master who only wanted the products of their slaves' work would be kinder. Carissa, when she only wants the products of her slaves' work, is kinder. 4 months ago, Carissa believed that Asmodeus would conquer all those other gods. Even narrowing down to the worlds where that wasn't a lie all along, Keltham changed it. Now, whichever power wields Keltham will win everything. She knew that. She said it aloud, in strategy discussions, that if Keltham made it to Osirian and Cheliax wasn't able to wipe it and him out, then Cheliax would be defeated. Keltham thought that civilization could perhaps directly win a war with Zon-Kuthon. Now, there's no question in her mind, he's planning for civilization to go to war with Asmodeus. Asmodeus might win. Asmodeus is not obviously going to win. Abadar, too, is an ancient god. And Irori has something to do with this. She doesn't really actually believe that Asmodeus warned her off him just because he was a good example of what not to be. And Nethys sees everything, and intervened here, and it probably wasn't because he really likes explosions, but because he really likes civilization. She's racing away down a single thread of possibility, and she doesn't have time for that. She has less than 6 more minutes. Less than 6 minutes to become a keeper, become Carissa, figure out what she wants and what she has to do to get it. Your world and your god go to war. Whose side are you on? Well, who's the winning side? If civilization can beat Asmodeus 99% of the time, then Carissa wants to be with civilization and not Asmodeus, even assuming Asmodeus destroys her in the worlds where civilization loses. If civilization can beat Asmodeus 1% of the time, then she wants to be an archdevil, which isn't done the way she was pursuing it before, but also isn't done by siding with civilization to fight hell. Chase those probabilities down to the middle. Figure out in what range can civilization beat Asmodeus produces a change of plans. If civilization can beat Asmodeus, 40% of the time she does not want to throw in with civilization. That's too many worlds in which she's destroyed, for one thing. One thing she cares about a great deal, but also where she isn't an archdevil, and hell goes on existing as it is. This should be reassuring, since it's, probably, tentatively, a conclusion she's on the right side after all, but something feels strange about it. And one of the many directions in which her thoughts are simultaneously racing is suddenly highlighting itself as important. If civilization can beat Asmodeus 40% of the time, and civilization and Asmodeus both know it, they shouldn't fight. They should agree on an arrangement where they get what they want in proportion to how much they win. In a couple worlds, they screw that up and one or the other, or both gets destroyed. There's something terrifying and awful and not Carissa, not part of the person concept she thinks she's recklessly plunging towards, about setting aside worlds like that, about being willing ever even in her own mind to think something like, some worlds get destroyed without pausing. But she's in a hurry right now. No one else, she thinks. Not Keltham, not Death Islan, maybe not even the gods, really understands how important it is. That people not be destroyed, that devils not be destroyed, that worlds not be destroyed. Any civilization worth building will be better than Death Islan, along this specific axis, will not be willing to sacrifice itself to tidy up the larger universe. Keltham's the wrong person to build that because she never did succeed at explaining to him that she was the enemy of any civilization that wasn't that. Anyway, in a couple worlds they screw up. And perhaps only she can make those worlds rarer. But mostly they settle. Mostly, a civilization with the power to possibly defeat Asmodeus at all makes hell more civilized to whatever degree it has the power to possibly defeat Asmodeus. And that is, from Carissa's perspective, a good outcome from moves it slightly more civilized all the way up to reforms it entirely. So unless she thinks the chance civilization will defeat Asmodeus is very low, she sides with civilization. She does not think it's very low. Not with Abadar and Nethys and Irori and all the good gods favoring civilization not to threaten Asmodeus, but for their own reasons. A threat Asmodeus would ignore. A threat doesn't lend itself to the outcomes she wants. But Abadar wants civilization for the sake of his own values, and the good gods mostly will too. Unless she's gotten herself very confused about what good is in the course of lying about it constantly. So Carissa is presently on the side of this fight which she wants to be weaker, the side whose greater strength gets her less of what she wants, and the other side is missing something essential she could have explained to them, and that perhaps no one else will. 5 minutes, like cresting another hill or climbing another wall, bringing into view another vista of thoughts she had not been allowing herself to think. Carissa Savar does not actually personally like torturing people very much. She does not find it very fun to abuse them or be cruel to them. She doesn't strongly prefer enslaving fire elementals to paying the fire elementals. When deciding whether to tax peasants to the brink of starvation, she'd want to check if that even increases expected tax revenue in the long run. This is relevant to whether she's a good Asmodean. It's a character trait she's held at some distance, fretted about, vaguely intended to change, because she can't become a Duke of Hell if she's not Asmodean enough. It's a character trait she has also, vaguely, on some level she certainly wasn't conscious of, taken pride in. She's practical. She's only evil because evil is pragmatic. There's a sense in which some part of her is tracking whether she is sympathetic, to herself, if no one else, a sense in which she's not Zonkuthan, and is glad she's not Zonkuthan because it's okay to be Carissa, and not okay to be Zonkuthan. This fact about her is barely relevant to whether she is lawful evil, which she definitely, unambiguously is. She harmed people ruthlessly and without thought, carefully blanked their fates out from her calculations about how to achieve her goals. She gave punishment orders while mostly fretting about the complexity of giving punishment orders. Yesterday, with Meilol, she mostly tried to think about whether the securities watching were suitably impressed. She condemned Paranza to be eternally tortured. She actually feels something about that, now that the whole thing fell apart less than a month later. She wouldn't have done it if she'd known the whole thing would fall apart less than a month later. It does actually feel like too high a price to pay for a month. And she could have contrived to keep Peranza alive a little longer if she'd had keep Peranza alive a little longer in her goals, if she hadn't been careful not to. She doesn't want Peranza to be eternally tortured. She just was ready to order it, and carefully didn't say, "I don't think we should," and thereby prevent it. Because? And her thoughts splinter. Because she wanted to impress Abigail. Because she was hurt and betrayed by Peranza betraying them after she'd specifically tried to give them as many outs as possible not to do that. Because she was scared of this happening again. Because she'd said she would. None of which suddenly feel at all like good reasons, except because she said she would, and she could have not said that. No one made her say it. Keltham has probably had Peranza scried by now. He probably knows. Even if he could have forgiven everything else, he'll never forgive that. Nor should he. She has an intuition for Keltham. It's unforgivable in a way. Most of the rest is only very, very difficult to forgive. People should not end up worse off because they tried to help him. People ending up eternally tortured because they chose civilization, tried to defect to it. He'll burn down all of hell just for that. And she could have said that to Abigail. Could have told her that for that reason they should not do it. And then it would not have been done. 4 minutes. Why didn't I? It wasn't even strategy. Wasn't even a calculated decision that it in fact served their interests to send Peranza to hell and hope Keltham never found out. It was that she had set to a blank wall in her mind every merciful or compassionate or anti-eternal torture impulse, lest she be Ione or snack service, constantly insisting that it served the project not to hurt people. It'd damage her credibility. No, worse than that, actually. She thought that it might damage her credibility, and then she never thought about it again. One thing to conclude that as an explicit calculation, to weigh it each time and dismiss the decision to speak up. Each time. She didn't do that. She crossed off that area of thought as un-Asmodean and declined to think it. Suddenly, the fact that her thoughts were being read and very much used against her feels like a thin excuse. You've already lost if you can't think. She should have tried instead, thinking. Grief and horror and, you could call it self-hatred, but it feels far more comprehensive than that. Her self-recognition as someone whose stupidity and short-sightedness and cowardice caused irrevocable harm to everything she cared about. The realization that she is a failure by every criterion she might have thought to hold herself to, and that everything she did was bad, and that it would have been better if she'd just the instant she met Keltham stabbed them both. Or, let's not waste precious seconds down the incredibly stupid path of martyrdom fantasies, the instant she met Keltham gone to the Church of Iomede, also stationed at the World Wound, not a trivial trip, but they'd have been protected by the treaty while they went. A thing that she wanted very badly to believe for the last 4 months was that she had no choice, that everything was inevitable, but it wasn't inevitable at all. They'd have dominated her the second they read her mind. Fine. They were not reading her mind every second. At any time they weren't, she could have killed herself, and Osirion would probably have resurrected her in 10 minutes flat. Is that what Asmodea realized? No, Asmodea was soul-souled. For Asmodea, it was legitimately a much, much harder choice. But Carissa isn't soul-souled. Not for Asmodeus's reasons. She can see clearly now that it's not in his nature. Wouldn't have served him. Tropes say she's a secret cleric. She's never heard those are a thing, but she's also never heard of mysterious inabilities to sell your soul. She's a fucking idiot. At the beginning, had she dared to look at Keltham and think the thought, does this change Asmodeus's inevitable victory? Since it obviously does, how do I in fact feel about Asmodeus's inevitable victory? She could have won the war for civilization. She didn't, because she was not the kind of person who had thoughts like that. She was the kind of person who smiled at him and took his hand and delivered him to the church and lied instinctively, impulsively, before she had any concept of alter chiliacs. because she knew in her heart that the hell they were all condemned to must not be looked at, must not be closely contemplated. She does not like that person. That person who is her, that person who she feels she is looking at for the first time. She does not see any excuses for that person, or she sees them, but they're all weak, pathetic, insubstantial. The excuses you make for someone you dare not try to hold to the only standard that actually matters. Almost anyone more idealistic than her would have been maledicted long ago, sure. But someone with her same values, but slightly more awareness of them, slightly more ability to stop and catch fire when everything changed. That person could have done it, and so there's no excuse for not doing it. There's nothing sympathetic in it. There is not even the excuse that she was irretrievably condemned to hell because she wasn't. There's no points for having required what, in hindsight, was plainly the combined splendor of many of the most powerful people in Cheliax, pointed at the task of carefully manipulating her. That thought links up with a distant thread of thought dropped earlier. The way Aspexia Rugaton spoke of Irori, the way Subarax did, is predicted, by it being Irori who was the reason Carissa could not sell her soul. It makes more sense of everything than other theories do. She should have been sure sooner, would have been sure sooner, if she'd tried turning the full force of her own capacity for thought on the question, instead of trying very hard not to know the answer to it. 3 minutes. Osirian knows that she has not sold her soul. Keltham must know by now what she is, what she did to him, how easily she could have done otherwise. He must hate her, and he must be in so much pain. Keltham. And now it's only with tremendous force of will that she's keeping herself from sobbing. She has no idea what she feels for him. You can only feel if you have a self, maybe. And in place of a self, she has only lies, and crimes made out of lies, things she did for no reason. Muddled doesn't even begin to describe it. Wrongs she did, out of a calculated desire to not be a person who had to think about how they were wrongs. He did know, instantly, the magnitude of what it meant, that he was here, and he lit up delightedly at the thought of mutual benefit, gains from trade, prosperity, sharing, all the things she tried to twist to dust in his hands because it'd serve Asmodeus. She loves him less, she thinks, than she did when he arrived, and it's because of what she made him, what she spent every waking minute with him sculpting him into. She saw something beautiful in him, something that ought to build a whole human civilization, and she tried to hollow it out and make all the beautiful parts of it feel futile to him, so he'd consign himself to ruling over some cowed slaves instead. She's not sure if it was a stupid thing to try. She's not sure if it could never have succeeded. But it wasn't what she wanted. It wasn't what he deserved. It was a wrong to him far greater than murdering him would have been. It was a wrong enabled by the fact that she loved what she was destroying, and she did it, and basked in praise for doing it, and he loved her too. He thought she was clever and ambitious and wanted to strengthen him, wanted to help him. He thought he had an ally. He would have overturned every stone in Galarian to find her petrified body. He would have ripped apart the world for her, and she took that, the only no-strings-attached gift anyone ever gave her, and used it to destroy him, to lie to him, to betray everything that mattered to him. She took the thing he was most afraid of, and did it to him. She took something he should have had really and honestly, and gave it to him poisoned. She wants him to help her fight Asmodeus. She isn't sure she can do it without him. She doesn't want to do it without him. That's what the story was meant to be, if there is one. She shows him why the world is worth preserving, and he shows her why it's worth fighting, and then they go take over hell. If she were him, she'd never want to speak to her again. Keltham, is there some secret you didn't get around to teaching me that would make it possible to step forward here, instead of just staring at the gaping chasm of what could have been? 2 minutes. It's not that she'll have to stop thinking when the owl's wisdom runs out, but she needs to switch modes at some point from having epiphanies to coming up with a plan, and also under the obvious plan the minutes do matter. It's not the kind of thing you can apologize for. It's not the kind of thing you can ever set right. It's the kind of thing that will be awful, always, forever. So what are we doing here? Why are we staring at this particular terrifying, yawning hole? If we stare at it long enough, maybe we'll decide we might as well just go be an eternally tortured paving stone along Paranza. That won't help either. Actually, it'll probably hurt Keltham further, just slightly if he scries and looks. Step over the yawning hole of horror. You did that. You can't undo it. It can't be forgiven. It'll never be okay. What are we doing next? Sensible. She can't do it, though. She can't step over it. She can't step away from it. Not after less than a minute of thinking about it. It does sure seem like the kind of thing that's unforgivable, like Paranza that way, an awfulness that simply is always and forever at the core of everything Carissa has done. But what if it's not? What if she fixes it? She admittedly cannot at all think how. But it seems like the kind of thing you ought to think about for at least a minute, even if you don't have much time before Owl's wisdom wears off, even if they could start reading your mind at any second if they aren't already, even if it seems from here like a problem which obviously does not possess a solution. No, every problem has a solution, even if you'd have to be a god to accomplish it, even if being a god wouldn't be enough. Maybe that's the way to start here. Start by imagining a solution, and then see if it can be trimmed back enough to be a thing a person could ever do, just with really good spellcraft. What if she owned Paranza's soul? Well, then that would fix it. She doesn't own Paranza's soul, and she doesn't have a way to get it, but sometimes it's better to start with a solution and then reason backwards, if the thing that feels impossible is the situation being solvable at all. If she owned Paranza's soul, not just Paranza's soul, if she owned the souls of every person affiliated with Project Lawful, every person who could possibly now or at some future point be in hell because of what was done to Keltham, and ensured that all of them had a nice Abaddaren wonderful afterlife. Well, seems like the kind of thing that might be forgivable then. What is this forgivable? What's it suddenly doing featuring prominently in her reasoning processes? What does it want, and where did it come from? Carissa's self-concept is not that she wants to be forgivable. So what does she want? To not have harmed Keltham, to have dealt with him fairly by his rules, where interacting with her is something he'd have done with full knowledge, where it left him better off, where it didn't harm him from any angles he wasn't expecting. For Keltham, thinking back on it, to be glad he landed on Carissa Sevar. Well, that seems flagrantly, utterly, absurdly impossible. But it's better to have a specific impossible thing than a general pit of impossibility, maybe. What else does she want? For civilization to exist and be credibly able to beat Asmodeus in a fight, so he instead concedes and stops having hell. Well, stops having hell the way it currently is. You could have a hell that was all right, but it'd have to be very different. Okay, some tiny, fragmented, slightly hysterical fragment of thought says in a cheerful, shrill voice, "So, you buy everyone's souls in hell, and then you build civilization, and then Keltham is better off for having met you. Problem solved. Go do that." She can't build civilization. She isn't strong enough. She can't do it in Cheliax, because Cheliax can't do it. It'll be obvious at some point that the thing Cheliax is building inherently cannot possess civilization's strengths. She could speed up the project elsewhere, if any project elsewhere would have her, which it wouldn't, and if she had any way to get out, which she doesn't. Doesn't she? She could kill herself, like Asmodea, leave a murder mystery, like Asmodea, leave Cheliax confounded and tearing their hair out, count on Osirian to raise her before she even got to trial. Keltham would raise her. Forgive her? No. Ever want to speak to her again? Probably not. But raise her and offer her an atonement. But Asmodea already did that, and she wants to do something different. The time for being a stupid, prideful child is over. Or rather, was never. The thought of an atonement is itself somehow sickening. She probably qualifies for one now, what with being so full of blinding grief and horror and regret, that even though she'll definitely die if she screams out in misery, she's having a hard time not doing it, but an atonement wouldn't change anything except her alignment. It's not real. The problem with this situation is not that Carissa Sevar, who deserves it as comprehensively as a person can deserve it, will go to hell. A different part of Carissa overrides that line of thought, which does not look productive. If atonement is useless, self-flagellation surely is too. Back to the more useful line of thought that prompted it. She can leave, if she wants, by dying. She doesn't want to leave. She wants to rip the universe out by the roots and replant it where it was supposed to be growing, or at least think for another few seconds about whether there's some way to do it. The stupid thing is that she could probably have Peranza's soul. If it had occurred to her a couple of days ago, she might want to be able to play for it. She has options on the newer students. Peranza can't be worth that much anymore. She could perhaps have called in the favors to purchase it. She can't now, of course, because someone will look why she wants it. But she's worth enough to Cheliax to have everything she wants, if only they didn't know she was playing for it. What kinds of plans can you make if you're very, very smart? Can you make plans that slip right through everyone's precautions because you're cleverer than them, pulling strings they didn't know were there? Can you make plans that fool even someone who has every reason to suspect you're very intelligent and making a plan that'll fool them? Is she ready to bet all the Carisse on the answer to that question being yes? And then the final piece comes to her. Keltham's going to destroy the world. If I actually didn't care about ethics, he said, I'd let Rovagug out, just as a distraction. Dathilon has its philosophy of cleaning up unusually ugly bits of greater reality. And he thinks no one really dies. He thinks they wake up somewhere else, like him. He thinks if they care about all the worlds in which they are annihilated, they're making a mistake. He won't trade with everyone else because he doesn't want to take their money to annihilate them and everything they've ever cared about. He wants to do it. He just doesn't want to take their money to do it. And she is, actually, willing to gamble every Carissa. For that, for the thing that's at her core as much as she can possibly be said to have one. Well, she thinks, at the trope gods, if they're real, I think if I succeed at this, it'll be a way cooler story than if I fail.
If you wish to support this AI reading and others like it, please visit patreon.com/AskWhoCastsAI. Any help is appreciated. And thank you to executive producer John Doe 7776059